Welcome to Raising OKC Kids, Conversations with Metro Family in Oklahoma City. I'm Erin Page, and joining me today is Andy Moore to talk about engaging our kids in discussions about civics and the power of voting. Welcome, Andy. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Erin. Thanks for having me.
So before we get started, and I'm really eager to dive into this conversation because I feel like I have a lot to learn. But first, I want to tell our listeners a little bit more about you. Andy is a staunch advocate for democracy and diplomacy and civil and voting rights. He's a licensed professional counselor, and his early professional experiences in mental health and public health highlighted the need for common sense public policy. In 2016, Andy founded Let's Fix This to encourage civic engagement and promote good policy in Oklahoma. He's the executive director of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, a broad group of organizations and supporters of pro-voter democracy reform, among his many other volunteer and entrepreneurial ventures. Andy's also a husband and dad and an advocate for public education. So, Andy, let's start there in your dad role. As we are entering this presidential election year, there is likely a lot of division, hard conversations, and frustration ahead for many of us. What a positive way to start out. Regardless of where people fall on the political spectrum, we're kind of all in this like tense, it's coming mode right now. So how do you plan to navigate all of this as a dad? And what are the key discussions that parents should be having with our kids this year?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And just for context, my kids are 12, 10, and 4. And so not so much for the 4-year-old, but certainly for my older kids, this is starting to come up. Like they're aware of my job, and they, start to ask questions about candidates, especially once we have yard signs and commercials, right? I remember in 2022, they would see all these political ads on YouTube when they're watching, someone that's like streaming a video game, and would say, "Oh, we see those commercials all the time." And what I try to help guide my own kids, and I think what I recommend to others, right, is to um, pull back from some of the partisanship and some of the emotional arguments around some of these things. We all know that a lot of the campaign rhetoric is designed to elicit a certain response from us, right? From voters, usually some kind of emotional response. But if kids have questions about specific policies, on occasion that happens to come up, right? They might see something and say, "Is that true?" Or "What's going on with this?" And trying to really like tie everything or root it in facts when you can. And if you're not sure, never be afraid to say you don't know. And I think, I grew up in a house that was not very political. I think my parents usually voted. We didn't ever talk about it. And I think they probably in some ways wanted to shelter us and not have we as kids like worry about those political things. And I think there's probably some wisdom in that today as well. But making sure that there's still a teachable moment in a lot of these conversations. And so finding the way to include your kids in that conversation in a way that is relevant to them, I think can yield some positive results. And more importantly, I think this is a good opportunity to instill a sense of civic duty or responsibility in our kids. And I love taking my kids to vote or taking them to the Capitol if I go up there, because it can be a formative experience for them. And I like asking them afterwards, like, "What did you think about that? Like, did that make sense? Was that scary or confusing or fun or exciting?" And help them kind of process through their own emotions about what civic participation might look like. Sometimes questions as simple as like, "Well, why do we vote there at that church?
Hmm.
Why don't we vote somewhere else? Like, why don't we vote at the Capitol?" Right? That was a funny question where I was like, I never even considered the idea that kids might think we should all vote at the Capitol. And so talking through like it allows us as parents to think about, well, why do we structure our democracy, our electoral system in the way we do, and helps, I think, all of us like gain a greater appreciation for that participation and what it looks like for all of us.
Mm, that's so good. As I was preparing for this conversation, I was reminded of, especially my youngest, but all of my kids, and mine are close in ages to yours. Mine are 12, 10, and 8. when we start getting flyers or they're seeing commercials on TV, my favorite thing that they ask me is, Mom, do we like that candidate?
Right.
And I always, there are times when I like certainly answer more emotionally than I should, but when I can catch myself, I will say, well, here's what I like about their policy, or here's what dad likes about this candidate. And you don't have to like the same people we like. So here's some things for you to know, and you get to decide for yourself, which sometimes is a little bit painful because, you know, we want our kids and all the people around us generally to like a lot of the same things we do. But I just love that question, and I love reframing it for them that just because this is what I think is good about this person's decisions doesn't mean that's what you have to think.
Yeah. Well, and so my two older kids are from a previous marriage. And so, I mean, their mom and I it's all cordial and everything, but there's still a different home that they live in for part of the time. Right. And so I'm always conscientious of like, I don't know entirely what messages they're getting there, if any, probably not much, but trying to like help them in every way we can, right? They're having to navigate the world, especially my oldest who's in middle school now, and like everything's going to get real difficult just at a personal level, right? Like middle school is difficult for everybody, and trying to be like, I don't want to make it any worse for him, but how can I equip him, I think, to think about those things. And like you, I sometimes like asking my kids like, well, what's your impression of these candidates, because they see the commercials too, right? They might say, oh, they seem mean or not nice, or they seem real friendly or whatever. And we also don't hide things from them unnecessarily. For example, where I live, we have a school board race coming up in just next week, and so we had flyers for the two candidates for school board on the dining room table, and they were kind of looking at them, and my wife and I were talking about it, and they could kind of hear our own conversation of like, well, what do we know about these people? Let's look them up on their websites and see that we were putting some time into it. And I think that's worthwhile. And I was, I think, somewhat affirmed in this approach by an episode of Bluey, where it's voting day, right? And Australia has different voting rules in lots of ways, but it's just a brief clip in the beginning where they're walking along and there's like signs for candidates, and the girls are asking, who are all these signs? I'm like, well, don't vote for him. He looks scary. And it was a reminder that like kids see the world through their own eyes. And sometimes that can be, I don't know, illuminating, I think, to even to us as adults.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I do love hearing what my kids' impressions are of whether it's the flyers or the commercials. It is really interesting, I think, to get their take on it. And it can be kind of a relief to have conversations with an 8-year-old rather than listening to all the messages that are coming at us from everywhere else. Speaking of which, let's talk about debates on TV. So when we're watching those debates, whether, you know, it's a local election or national election, what tips can you provide to teach our kids what truly effective debate entails? And sometimes that's not what we see on TV.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the version we see now is very different than what it used to be. And in many cases, like less useful to voters, really, to parse out, where the candidates stand on issues. And so again, I think that's an opportunity to talk to kids, like asking them if they happen to watch it, um, you know, like, do you think he answered the question? Or, like kind of asking those questions, which is stuff that we all kind of wrestle with. Um, but then also, I think framing that what a debate could be or should be, right? Like what civil discourse looks like, because a way to have better conversations, right, including arguments or debates, is that's like a life skill that everybody could use a refresher course on, and maybe maybe the presidential debates or other public debates like serve as an example of what not to do in some of these things, that what they do on stage on television is less useful in everyday life, I think, than what we could model for kids. And so I know I've got friends that are debaters in school or to teach debate now, and uh, I would love to see my kids actually like formulate good arguments that they're trying to pitch. Why we should have cake instead of ice cream or something after dinner, and let them be participatory in it. I think there's some real usefulness in that.
That's such a good idea to give them a topic like that to kind of frame that around. Um, I think too, it can be really hard when we're watching debates as a family or even just talking about it later for our kids to understand one, those aren't always a great indicator of a debate. And two, that it is important for all of us, grown-ups included, to have those opportunities to converse civilly with people that we might disagree with. So
Hmm.
how do we get that lesson across to them? Again, when we don't necessarily have debates on TV that are reflective of that.
Right. Over the last few years, I have spent a lot more time thinking about what kind of behavior we as voters and as a society incentivize politicians, right? Like how do we incentivize them to campaign and to govern? Are they incentivized to be responsive to the majority? Are we incentivizing them to be compassionate, to be thoughtful, to be intentional in like how they approach governing? Or do we incentivize this like escalating battle, right, between two candidates? Or in many cases, right, there's three or four candidates. We just don't always give them the space to participate in that. And with my kids in particular, like, we try to incentivize good behavior with them, and a civil discourse between, especially my two oldest. And so I think there's probably parenting lessons that we can apply to our political system as well, of like maybe the way we've designed stuff could be different, right? We want to incentivize what I think most Americans probably think of as like good leaders. Now, that's obviously everyone has a different impression of what constitutes a good leader, but just making sure that our votes and our participation helps incentivize the things that we aspire to have, I think, as a society are important.
That's great. I love that. Especially for our older kids who are online more, perhaps on social media, how do we help teach them? And again, maybe either learn ourselves or get a bit of a refresher, the importance of media literacy to be able to find and discern accurate information, and then also being able to distinguish between opinions and facts.
Yeah. This is, I mean, a skill set I think that honestly kids are probably growing up with better than I did, and certainly better than my parents and grandparents, right? Like our children today that are digital natives that have grown up with the internet their entire life have gotten increasingly good at spotting ads, or spotting sponsored content versus regular content in response, right? Advertisers and others have gotten better about making their ads look like native content on websites. And so, in our house, we just don't watch a lot of TV. We've got sports and we're busy. But especially now, as my kids are getting older and, watching more stuff on YouTube or even streaming services, I think the opportunity to see ads and kind of process it with them is helpful. So I don't, I may get tired of watching my son's videos about Minecraft and Fortnite and stuff, but there's still opportunities, even with streaming, that I've noticed in the last, probably 4 months, is like how they respond to YouTubers, which is not that's not something I had to learn when I was 10, but how they describe what's happening in the game, and I try to inform of like this isn't all exactly what they're saying. Like, don't you think they're trying to get you to watch something? There's something here like, how long do you think he actually played for versus how long this video is, to help, I think, highlight the disconnect between what happens in real life versus what happens on the internet sometimes. And I think when it comes down to other information, like we'll say like the facts of history or the way the world kind of works, we have those same opportunities. I think it's as kids in elementary school and older start doing more research and having to, like, my daughter is, in fourth grade and having to like kind of write little papers, to the extent that fourth grade write a term paper, but she had to look up stuff in encyclopedias and find stuff. And so that was an opportunity to talk through where do you think this information came from? Like, why is this trustworthy? How do you know if something is trustworthy or not? Um, and then helping them like in just little bite-sized opportunities, right? Bite-sized pieces to help reaffirm what is reputable information versus what is disreputable, or again, the kind of motives behind it. And a simple example, right, is how advertisers might show a, a sugary cereal versus, I don't know, wheat checks or a non-sugary, healthier thing. I'm not saying either one are bad, but even the kids are good at like understanding, like, well, that's a fun commercial, and this is that commercial's for grown-ups, and you're like, right. So, do you think they're advertising to different audiences? What do you think they want you to know, or they want you to feel about this product? Um, and it's helped, I think, with my son as he's gotten into being interested in cars. He started to associate certain kind of types of people with certain vehicles, right? Like the macho man that drives the truck versus the slick guy in a sports car, or, whatever. And so just kind of using each of those little opportunities as a chance to talk through some of that stuff, I think it all adds up, right? Like, I think as parents, everybody, I am always guilty of feeling like each moment is the most important ever. And really, most moments will be totally forgotten by our children, and they are left with some sort of overarching impression of us as parents and of the world that we've helped them experience. And I want them to go into it eyes open, prepared, but somewhat cautious as they proceed.
I love the idea of talking through ads with our kids. And that question you asked, what do you think they're trying to get you to do? Are they trying to persuade you? What do you think they want you to do with this information? I think that can be so helpful because our kids are smart. They can figure that out when we pose those questions. So I love that idea. And I think whether it's commercials about cereal or about political candidates, that's helpful in them starting that process of really being able to discern what it is that somebody's trying to get them to do with the information they're placing in front of them.
Yeah. The funny flip side to this is, you're doing a good job when they use it back
Oh
against you,
gosh,
right?
yes.
Where we had two discussions this weekend. One was about, do Pop Tarts constitute a meal? And my son was like, he likes to put butter on Pop Tarts, which I find terrifying. But he was like, well, there's protein in butter, and I was like, well, he's not entirely wrong, but this is a slippery slope. And he was arguing that Pop Tarts were a whole meal, and he said on the commercial, like they say, it's a breakfast. And I was like, well, it's part of a complete breakfast. And then my daughter later argued that sandwiches were not a meal because you should have a drink and chips and an apple or whatever. And I was like, okay, there's something starting to sink in here because it's very frustrating to me when I'm like, that's the argument I would make on the other side as well. So maybe that's an affirmation that we're doing the right thing.
I love it. And I will add a somewhat similar experience we had at my house where my middle son, who's 10, and I were talking about advocating for yourself. And this was about trying to get a medical appointment for him that, was months booked out. And so we're talking about sometimes when you're advocating for yourself, you just have to keep asking over and over again. And he's like, well, don't they get tired of you? I was like, yes. And sometimes that's the point. And then he said, why does this not work on you?
Right.
And I was like, well, I think you do try it a lot on me. So there you go.
Right.
You're learning how to advocate for yourself, both inside and outside this home. So yeah, I totally feel that. Those lessons that you're like, these are so important for you to learn. You do not have to try them all out on me
Right.
first.
Right. There's a right time and a wrong time, right? We try to and every family is different. We try to do that with language too, where I say there's no bad words, only bad timing.
Hmm.
And that's come up a few times where I'm like, okay, this was bad timing. That was so the clearly you learned the word, but now let's talk about when it's appropriate and when it's not. And I anticipate that will be an ongoing lesson for us to work through.
I love that. Yeah, all of those parenting moments that you're like, yes, you do get that. And I'm so glad that I get to be your guinea pig, but
Yeah, right.
better to
Definitely.
do it at home than elsewhere, I guess. So another piece of a lot of tension for people in Oklahoma is that we're in the midst of legislative session. What advice can you share with parents about the most effective ways to connect with their legislators to advocate for causes they care about? Is it to keep calling them over and over again, like we're learning at my house?
Yeah, I think, I like the way that you worded that about what is most effective, and what is most effective is not always what's most convenient
Mm.
for us. Obviously, like in-person conversation with your legislators is the most effective. And the way that I really like to frame this is that it is the relationship that matters most, right? The words you say and how you say it is important, but that contributes or comes out of your relationship with your elected official. And honestly, most of us don't have one, right? Most people don't even know who their legislators are. They might not have ever met them unless they happen to have them knock on their door during a campaign at some point, but that is not always the case. And so I think the responsibility then is on us as citizens of this great state is to just do a little bit, right? Look up, Google online, who is your state house member or your state senator? They might live near you, right? Like my state senator happens to live down the street from me. I didn't know that when we moved in, but now I see her walking her dog and walking her daughter to school. And there are opportunities then that I didn't know I would have otherwise to build a relationship with elected officials. And if you can, go to the Capitol, right? It's open all the time. We own the building, right? As people, as citizens of the state, we own the building. You can go up there. Um, Ideally, maybe call in advance or send an email and schedule a time um, that works around. You don't want to go up there when they're, in session and can't easily come out and talk to you. But most legislators are very open and willing to talk to their constituents in particular. And they do that because so rarely do people go up there. When I started going to the Capitol in 2016, I had never been before. Most people who came with us had never been before. We didn't want to have a big rally or like yell and scream. I genuinely just wanted to go in and meet my legislators and say, hey, at the time we were in this big budget crisis and I'm worried. My friends are getting laid off. Our state's headed in the wrong direction. What are you going to do about it? And if they didn't have plans, or even if they did, I'd say, okay, like, here's what I would support, right? Like, as my elected official, here's what I would encourage you to do. And there's a chance for a conversation there. And you might not win them over that first time. You might not move them at all. But you've planted a seed and you've started building a relationship. For folks who maybe aren't able to go to the Capitol due to distance, transportation, or time, you can always send an email, right? 24 hours a day. It doesn't have to be fancy worded. I mean, just a personal email can make a big difference. And again, is a way to build a relationship because most people don't do it. It is hard for me to emphasize enough how little the public interacts with the state legislature. If they hear from even 7 people about a particular bill, it is a very big deal because most they hear nothing about. And so anything you can do, an email, a phone call up there and speak to their assistant and always be nice to the assistants because they're the
Always.
gatekeepers and it's an unsung hero kind of role. Just like the front desk at your school or anything else, they're the ones that have to deal with a lot of the riffraff. But it's always good to call. And the for me, the light bulb moment when we started going up there in 2016 was that if I didn't go to the Capitol and express my preference for what my legislators did, somebody else was going to, right? If I don't go, if not us, who? Somebody will be up there. And that other person is probably a paid lobbyist, which isn't necessarily bad, but they are incentivized. They are paid to be there by somebody for a particular opinion. And that might be different than mine. And so if we don't speak up, there's not like a lobbying firm just for the public. We are we are the lobbyists, we are the people. And so if you don't speak up, then somebody else is. And I don't like it when people make decisions in a vacuum. I think it's worth us chiming in and sharing what we can. So in-person conversations is the most effective. Emails and phone calls are great, right? Anything is better than nothing. And the more you can do. And to your point about calling and calling and calling, Generally speaking, nagging is not going to get you very far, but regular, thoughtful conversation can. Um, I always encourage people to tell their story, like why does this piece of legislation, why does this issue matter to you? Do you have a personal connection to it in some way? And that is important to share because nobody knows your story if you don't tell them. And so often, I mean, we see legislators every year who rely on those stories to help make a point, right? There's times that I've called and shared something, and then they've asked, "Do you mind if I share that on the floor, like during debate?" And well, okay. Well, suddenly your story has the chance of maybe swaying opinions around a policy, and it's easy to get jaded about, whether or not debate in the legislature even matters in today's environment. But I think on the right issues, when shared the right way, it definitely can. And there's no harm in doing it, right? Again, if you don't speak up, somebody else is.
Thank you for infusing a little bit of hope into the season that can feel very tense. I think we sometimes forget. I know I have had occasions where I forget, and I try not to anymore. But even if I'm having a conversation with a legislator, I know that we both disagree. I know that I'm probably not going to sway them. I always try to remember to thank them for listening, to thank them for the time they spent with me. And like you said, always thank their assistants because they don't get very many thank yous.
No, I mean the elected officials who are the most difficult to work with, the often their staff are the ones that just get assigned there, and they find them difficult to work with too. And so I'm trying to be a little extra compassionate. Where I walk in, I'm like, "How did you end up in this office?" Right? Okay, you're doing the Lord's work here. We appreciate you for being here,
That's
and
right.
trying to do what they can, right, to kind of keep our democracy on track.
Absolutely. What are some key actions and lessons that parents can start to impart now while our kids are at home so that they will become civic-minded citizens? We've talked about several things already today, but anything else jump out at you that parents can and should be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think since having kids, have become much more cognizant of the importance of knowing our history, right? And like teaching the truth of American history and our state history. And I know the last, several years, 5 years, I think that has been a bit of a lightning rod for a lot of folks. Like America as a whole, our society is wrestling with aspects of our society that are uncomfortable and hurtful at times for everybody in different ways. And just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it, right? Like hiding our head in the sand is never the way to move forward. And so being able to talk with our kids about what this means, everything from, a lot of schools still celebrate like Land Run Day. And obviously, there's a lot of complicated history and politics around that, or at least complicated conversations. And all of these things are like opportunities to help our kids shift their minds from a very concrete kind of black and white yes no dyad of thinking about the world good and bad to helping them experience the breadth of the grayscale out there and understanding the nuance of some of these things. And that is difficult. My son is, as he's learning in school, like we'll go through phases, right, of learning about Greek history to the Civil War to World War II. And this weekend he was talking about World War One for some reason. And he was like, "I don't really understand how it started." I was like, "Well, let's look it up and kind of talk through that." And then his question was like, "Why did we go to war over this?" It's like, it's a good question, right? There's a big difference in having a disagreement that escalates into a multinational war than finding other ways to work through stuff. And it gave us a chance to, play armchair quarterback to history of, well, how do you think they should have responded? What could have been different? Uh, and I think that's a healthy and exercise, right? Um, because it gives them some framing for how to work through troubling times, whatever it is, whether it's the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, or it's not getting enough playtime in your soccer game because someone else was a ball hog. Okay, well, how do we navigate these relationships in a way that's I think helpful and healthy. And obviously, doing all this, I think we often know our own kids, and like it's easy to come in too heavy-handed of like, this is a teachable moment. You're gonna learn something here, because they probably don't really care. So I try to let the kids take the lead on asking questions and see where their mind is going, and not try to lead them there to a big lesson. I know when I was growing up, right, you could tell when your parents are trying to teach you a lesson, and that's the point at which you tune out.
Mhm.
So you got to sneak up on them.
That's right. Sneak up on them. I love it. So most of our kids will not be able to actually vote this year. You talked about that you like to take your kids to vote with you. I do too, and they get really mad if I go while they're at school. What are some other ways that we can involve our kids during this presidential election year that are meaningful and will be meaningful to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of kids, especially from middle childhood on up, always appreciate being in on grown-up conversations, right? Like it's when your kids start kind of hanging around the dinner table when you've got friends over and they're kind of listening in, may not be saying much, but they like being in on the conversation, and so letting them, right? Like it's okay to share your opinions and to let them know how you feel about things, being mindful, right, that they are impressionable young minds and they might go repeat what you say to their friends and think through how that might play out. Also think about what their friends might be saying to them and how they need to have a different framework to understand the messages that they receive from the world outside of your family. And so, we anything like that we can do, um, we and even helping them process if they do share like what their friends are saying, or so and so's got this. Okay, well, how do you feel about that? Let's start there. That's maybe that's not what our family stands for, or maybe that is, or let's talk through how that shapes things. um for my kids right now, that comes up more in terms of like who is supporting which team in the Super Bowl. But I think those kind of team allegiances are increasingly applicable to how our politics in America are. Maybe to our detriment as a representative democracy, but I think helping them understand like how to be a good sport is a universally applicable lesson. Um, and again, I mean, things like letting them see the mailers you get for candidates, kind of letting them chime in with their impression of someone's mailer and helping them think critically, like, oh, this mail piece says, X, Y, and Z. What do you think they left out? Or what questions do you have? And helping them like think through what are all the things we need to know to make an informed decision can again be helpful, I think, both to the children and to us as voters. And I will add one brief point of fact that anyone who will be 18 by election day can register to vote. So if you are 17 and a half, as long as you have to be 17 and a half, you can register to vote early and they will process it on your birthday and then mail you your voter ID card. So if your child is someone who will turn 18, anytime between now and an election day, then I guess we're not quite within that 6 month window, but be thinking about it. I know a lot of schools are, providing forms. You can do it online now. Have to get a driver's license, which makes it really convenient. So we try to encourage, everybody to vote.
That's really good to know. Andy, as we wrap up today, what's your top message for our parent listeners about how we as parents can get engaged civically this year and why that matters for our kids in the long run?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I have my message I say every year of like everyone should vote, rah rah rah, which is true. But I also recognize that I think in the current political environment in America, the two front runners for presidential races are broadly unpopular, right? Like most people don't like either one of these guys for a myriad of reasons. And I think that worries me because there's a good chance, right, that a lot of people will just say, I don't like these guys. I'm just not going to vote. And the message that unintentionally sends to our kids is you don't have to participate. You can opt out. And while you can, again, you're leaving our democracy up to somebody else then, right? If you don't vote, somebody else is. And then what do? You're going to complain for the next 4 years when you didn't do the one thing you could do, which is to cast your vote. And more importantly, even if you don't want to engage in the presidential race, which I understand, right? Like there's a lot of rhetoric and partisanship around that feels icky to me. There are a lot of other races on the ballot, right? The state house, the state senate, school board, local races. There, maybe ballot questions, state questions on there. There's a lot of other stuff that will be there that is very important, right? All of it matters. Every vote really does matter. And by demonstrating to our kids, regardless of what age they are, that this is something that Americans do, right? This is what our nation was founded on. Like we have a participatory form of government where it is up to us, the people, we, the people, have a role to play and model that behavior for them. We're planting seeds for a strong democracy in our children that we hope will grow into those strong oak trees, right? In 20, 30, 40 years from now, when they will pass those same lessons on to their children. And we can continue this great experiment for another generation.
Such a good point. Thank you so much, Andy, for again infusing some hope into a subject that can feel a little bit hopeless and very overwhelming for a lot of us. I feel like more empowered to take this information that you have given and make this a more positive year in my household and look at the things I can control and the teaching moments that I can have with my kids and just hang on to that instead of a lot of the negativity.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Aaron.
Thanks everyone for listening. Join us next time on Raising OKC Kids.